Oh, okay, cool. Our final presenter is Taylor Berglund. Taylor is from Racine, Wisconsin. He will graduate in May with 2 majors, radio, TV, film, and English. After that, he plans to move to a major market for employment in the media industry, and his ultimate goal is to become a television scriptwriter. Taylor has served as president of His House Christian Fellowship, president of the UW-O Film Society, and has been involved at Titan TV and the Writing Center. And I asked, for those of you who don't know, I asked him all to give me a fun fact. And Taylor's fun fact is this: prior to college, Taylor was homeschooled, and for the whole time. Yes. Yep. Yes, and went on international mission trips throughout his childhood. So, the title of Taylor's thesis is "The Princess is in Another Castle: Narrative Structure, Interactivity, and Player Feedback in Video Gaming." And his thesis advisor is Doug Heil from Radio TV Film. So yours, Tim.
Okay. Do you know why the image is not showing up on the extended desktop? Extended desktop? Cool.
You'd think of radio, TV, film.
I know, you would think, but let's try this.
Nope.
Cool.
Right click,
Right click.
and then student information,
Right click where?
and desktop.
Oh, on the desktop. That's it. There we go.
And then duplicate some.
There we go.
Ta-da!
Yeah. There we go. There we go. Yes, I would like to keep those. All right. There we go. All right. So I'm Taylor, and this semester I've been working with Professor Doug Heil in the RTF department on my thesis, Princess in Another Castle: Narrative Structure, Interactivity, and Player Feedback in Video Gaming. So let's just dive into it, because there's a lot of things that I'm doing in this thesis, and so it's probably best not wasting time on it. So first off, let's talk act structure. So I'm kind of a nerd about plot, about story. That's really my in both the English and RTF departments. I love telling stories, and so I'm kind of fascinated with story. And you might be surprised to know that most stories follow a relatively straightforward pattern, and that's called the 3-act structure. And it's a pretty simplistic breakdown of stories. There's other more complex methods that I've seen before, but this is pretty generic and encompasses most stories that you're going to encounter. So you've got Act 1 of any story. Everyday life, something happens, and then the adventure begins. Pretty straightforward. That is almost every single story that you're going to encounter. And that adventure might take different forms, like obviously a movie like Hitch is going to have a very different sort of Act 1 than like The Hobbit, but I mean, it might be fun if they shared the same Act 1, but it'd be different movies. And so, but you've got Act 1, you're setting what are the stakes, what are we doing here? Act 2, the adventure itself. Challenges get harder and harder to overcome, and they test the resolve of our hero. Essentially, this is where we test how much do they really want that thing that they said, I want that, in Act 1. And this takes up the majority of the story. In a standard 2-hour movie, Act 1 is going to be maybe a half hour. Act 3, which we'll see ahead, will be probably like 20, 30 minutes, and Act 2 is going to be everything else. So I think mathematically that would be an hour to an hour and 20 minutes. So Act 3 is then achieving the goal, win the girl, stop the bad guy, tie up any loose ends. This is the conclusion of the story. Now, I should note, given all the happy endings here, they could fail at any of these. That's less common in stories, but then Act 3 becomes how do we deal with the fallout of that. And so that is pretty much every story in a nutshell. I want something, I try to get that thing, did I get it? And surprise, surprise, the same thing applies when we look at video game stories. So this is visualize the 3-act structure, and this helps a little bit. It's the drama ratcheting up as you go through. So you have the introduction, rising action, and the stakes get higher. You hit the ultimate peak, maybe fighting the bad guy there, or admitting that he loves the girl, and then the falling action. Loose ends get tied up. So we can see this in Super Mario Bros., which I have arbitrarily decided is the first first video game that has a story to it. And it's a simplistic story. It's not exactly Shakespeare, But Act 1. The the princess is kidnapped. Mario has to go save the princess. The princess has been kidnapped by a monster. Mario has to overcome obstacles to go save her. We reach Act 2. Mario moving through these absurd environments, trying to find the princess and save her eventually. And you get to crazy levels like that that really test your ability to make it through the level and not to throw your controller through the screen, as many, like myself, are apt to do. And then you've got Act 3. Thank you, Mario. Your quest is over. Pretty straightforward. And preceding this, fighting the ultimate bad guy, saving the girl. It's the standard story. But it's Super Mario Bros. And that's where video games start figuring out that they can tell stories, pretty much about the time that they start putting text in. This starts getting a little more complicated the next time we look at the story. So let's go 2 years later, 1987, The Legend of Zelda. Act 1, it's dangerous to go alone, take this. That is the beginning of the game. It's, here's a sword, go save the princess. Like, that's it. It's really simplistic, Act 1. Act 2, so you're going through the levels, right? So you go level 1, and you face off against this dragon here that just shows up, I guess. And, or, you could not go to this place. You could go to this other place with a different dragon, apparently. I don't know why there's dragons in all these images, but there are. And, or, you could just not deal with the dragons, and you could hang around in the overworld, Hyrule. You have suddenly options of what you can do, and you don't have to do these in any given order. You have to do all of them eventually, but you can decide what order you want to approach it in. And already it's getting a little more complex than the more passive medium of like film or TV shows, because you're suddenly shaping the story. You've decided, in a sense, what order the scenes go. And it all ends with Act 3. They all end in the same thing, so they branch out and then they come back together again. But you can see we're already getting a little more complex in our story goals here. So, essentially, in the years since then, video games have gotten a lot longer, graphics have gotten a lot better, we're not in that 8-bit style anymore, and essentially 3 types of stories have begun to develop, as proposed by Way and Calvert in a 2013 article on narrative theory. And I would say through my own study that these do hold true as mostly patterns. There is a 4th type called open world games, and this would be equivalent to Minecraft, The Sims, stuff like that. Where it's less a story and more like, here's a bunch of stuff to do, just knock yourself out. But there's not really an arc to your Minecraft journey, thinking about it in that sense. So when you're talking about story, which is what I'm focusing on in Thesis, because if I did everything, it would be way too long and you guys would be here forever. The first type is linear, and this is the closest thing that we have to TV, film, books, the normal types of media that we have. It's a passive thing. The story is being told to you. You're still a participant in it, but you're not really shaping the story actively. You're just reacting to stuff that happens. Straightforward, 3-act stories, and it's event 1 follows event 2, or event 3 follows event 2 follows event 1. Gotta get my verbs down there. But, and you can even view those as level 1, level 2, level 3. Games today aren't labeled as such, but it's basically the same type of idea. Now there are some pros to this model. You can tell traditional stories with refined emotional beats. I mean, the classic 3-act structure has lasted so long because it works for telling stories. Like it intuitively makes sense for us. It gives us the warm fuzzies when the hero beats the bad guy. Like overall, we like that type of story. And everyone plays the same game. Now you're not going to understand why this is weird until I show you the other 2 models, but suffice to say, you are not playing the same game as other people who have picked up the controller in the other 2 models. In this one, there is a uniformity of experience, which is kind of nice. It's also the easiest to make, just from a game design standpoint. Again, the complexity will become evident as we move through. There's some cons to this method. There's low replay value, low levels of choice. Again, you're passive in this. And once you finish the story, unless it's an amazing story, which games are starting to get to, but unless it's an amazing story, there's no reason to go back and do it again. You've experienced the story already. And especially with video games now reach like 20 to 40 hours pretty consistently. And there are some games, especially Japanese RPGs, that will reach over 100 hours. Like if you play it in the fastest way possible. They're just absurdly long. And so it would be like committing that you're going to watch all of Lost again because you love the story. And maybe you do, but that's 130 episodes, and that's a lot of time commitment. There's not a lot of incentive to replay it again. In addition, a weak story can bring down the whole game because you're really banking that they're invested in this one story we're telling. So this moves into the other type, branching, which is the other end of the spectrum. And this is the closest to a choose-your-own-adventure type of book. You remember those where like you read the first page and it's like, if you want to go right, turn to page 9. If you want to go left, turn to page 83 for some reason. And games function kind of like this. The player gets to make meaningful decisions. When I say meaningful decisions, they're decisions with consequences. They permanently impact the arc of the game's story. Essentially, after this decision, you will no longer, they're mutually exclusive. You cannot go back to see what was down the other choice you could have made. You've committed and you're in a completely different territory now. Now the pros of this model, players get really emotionally invested in this model because you're not a passive participant anymore. You are actively making the story and deciding what it's going to be about. And when you're doing that, you get really emotionally invested because this is my story now. And you get high replay value because then, usually these games are less long than the 100-hour ones, so it might be a 20-hour game, but at the end of it, you're like, what if I'd made completely different decisions at the beginning and opted not to kill this one person, but actually make them my best friend? And you can play the entire game, and the whole thing is a different experience as a result of it. Cons of this model. These take forever to make. They're really expensive. When you think about it, because of all the branches, some games end up trying to tell like 30 different stories, which is a lot more work than telling one story. And you have to program, and you have to design, and you have to animate, and you have to create levels for all of these different options, which gets really hard. And when you're telling 30 different stories, but they all have to kind of have the same elements, it is hard to send a consistent message or value system. Because the player can just decide, I don't want the consequences of this decision. And you're like, well, that was the point. So it gets a little hard to tell a coherent story that way. This is what a branching game story looks like by comparison. So remember that neat little event 1, event 2, event 3? That does not work in branching games. This is for a game called the Stanley Parable. And that start is up there, and you'll notice there are 5 options of how you could start this. You have 5 decisions that are all mutually exclusive of each other. And if you take one path, which is pretty common, the door one there, that leads you to all these other branches, and in total there are 23 different endings. All of those red and orange dots are all different endings. It's really insane from a story perspective to try to figure out how would you consistently send a message. And the answer for this game, it doesn't. Some of the endings directly contradict each other, which is kind of fun because it's a comedy game. But there's one more type of game style, and that's called the foldback. And this is a compromise model between linear and branching games. And it might seem kind of hard to fathom. One gives you choice, one does not. This one lets you pretend you have choice. It's that illusion of choice that you alluded to in the brand discussion. You give the player options, but really you don't. You just keep them on a track and you let them customize little stuff along the way. The pros of this, you get the positives of both extremes. Players want to play it again, but you still players want to play it again because they want to see what's different that they can make. And like, oh, what if I change this choice? Usually when they play it again, they find out it was roughly the same thing, but you know. And you get good player control that way. You can keep them still on an arc. You can still kind of tell them this is what the game is going to be about. And it's decently time and cost effective from a development standpoint, which is nice when you're making games and you sink multi-million dollars into them. You don't want to sink multi-million dollars. Also, discussions will be provoked by subtle differences. Oh, yours ended, you kept this character alive, I kept this other character alive. And really, they're just like the same person standing by your side in a level either way. But you get different dialogue options, and you can kind of discuss why did you make that decision? Why did you customize it that way? The cons of this model, though, it's what compromise happens. It's not as good as either of the extreme sides. You lose something in the process. And so you don't get as much replay value because people realize it's basically the same type of game. You don't get as much player control, and it still costs more than just making a linear game. There's also, this has really come up recently, player outrage if they feel that their decisions do not actually matter. So remember, they're getting really emotionally invested when they get to make decisions. And if you tell them, yes, but it ultimately didn't matter, people get pissed about that. A recent game, Mass Effect 3, claimed that it was going to have 1,200 different endings and ways it could be customized based on all the branches you took. it was going to take all your choices from the last 2 games too and also make that decide the ending. And it had 3 endings, which is slightly off percentage-wise from the 1200 promise. And people were really, really angry about it. This is what a fold-back game narrative looks like. So you see there's little decisions, but you're ultimately funneled back into a main story arc that way. And so ultimately, when the story ends, there's 3 endings here, and you had lots of decisions. And this is from a game called The Walking Dead, based on the comic book series that inspired the TV show, not the TV show. So yeah, this is, so I decided that I was going to try to run some numbers on exactly how games are set up, do a little bit of quantitative analysis, and figured out linear games way outnumber branching and foldback games, if you look at this, which is interesting, because linear games represent nearly 75% of all games, despite having no difference in critical or user reception. Now you might be wondering how I reached that number. Hang on 1 sec. Nope, okay, that slide's gone. But, which is weird because it was there this afternoon, but whatever. So let me explain for a moment, because there's a missing link here. Essentially what happened with this is I decided to do some quantitative analysis, and so I pulled up a website called Metacritic. Now Metacritic can be best likened to, if there's an IMDb for video games, and you guys have seen IMDb, it's a place that users can go in and they can rate a movie on a scale of 1 to 10. On Metacritic, people can do that with pretty much anything, but it's primarily used for video games, and they'll rate a video game on a scale of 1 to 10. So thousands of people use this website. This allows me to quickly gather data on what people feel about a game without having to be limited to, say, the Oshkosh sample group. So that was why I used Metacritic. Metacritic also compiles, just like Rotten Tomatoes does for movies, critical reception to the games as well. And so this allowed me to see if there was a critical or user rating difference between them. And I decided to categorize games into linear games, branching games, and foldback games. I created 2 different data sets in order to try to run different numbers, make sure it's not just a one-time thing, and figure out essentially if a certain genre was more beloved than another, or more reviled. And ultimately what I found kind of anticlimactically was there wasn't much of a difference between them, which makes sense, but not necessarily intuitively, so I'm going to have to explain that. But essentially, linear games, I found when I was putting the data sets together, represent 75% of all games. Branching and foldback share like 25% together. There were all of 3 branching games released last year. And there's hundreds, maybe even thousands of video games released. Only 3 of them are branching games, and only 6 of them were foldback games. And yet, despite all this, there is no difference in how well or disliked these games are. For some reason, they're just neglected genres, which struck me as a little bit odd. And so I would like to see those improve more, because I think that that's actually taking advantage of what games do very well in creating interactive stories in ways other media can't do. However, the non-intuitive way that this makes sense is that style needs to be suited to the story. So for instance, you've got, let's talk movies for a moment, move back from video games. So you've got Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino, love to make non-linear sorts of movies. Movies that go out of order, movies that have strange structure to them. And then you've got, say, Pixar, who are really traditional in the way that they tell their stories. Everything happens in order, there's a neat sequencing, there's usually not late act twists, that sort of thing. But would anyone say that Pixar's straightforward model or that Nolan's nonlinear model is inherently better than the other one? And so really what this comes down to is this is almost more of a genre difference. It would be like arguing that science fiction is superior to comedy. And subjectively, you could say that. But it really needs to be that the style of the narrative, the structure of it, is suited to the story that you're telling. Some games are not designed to be about choice, and they shouldn't be, because they're telling a more emotional narrative that doesn't need you to make decisions. Other games, like the Stanley Parable, are all about the illusion of free will as a theme. So you really should have choices in a game like that, or at least the illusion thereof. And so you can't strap a non-linear structure to a linear story and vice versa. And this was one of the interesting things that I found when I was doing research that kind of stood out to me. I also started noticing trends that united games together that had really high scores. So while genre, the structure didn't really matter, these things did. Strong characters. Now this is Mass Effect 2. all of these characters are people that you can have conversations with in the game that have complete narrative arcs on their own. And this moves it almost more into that TV showish realm that we mentioned briefly before. And when you think about it, that makes sense, because you don't watch TV shows like The Big Bang Theory or Seinfeld because they're reinventing the wheel on a story standpoint. You watch them because you like the characters inherently. They're exciting, they're fun for you. Friends, I mean, it's in the title. And so, similarly, video games are just now discovering this in like the last 5 years, that, hey, we should have good characters. And so they start doing that to strong effect. It's one of the highest indicators of a game's quality. In addition, consistent gameplay mechanics, introducing something early on that players are able to latch onto as this is how the game works. And then just building off of that. Mario is run to the right and jump. Like that's your whole moveset. But it keeps escalating in difficulty because they find new ways to challenge how you can execute that. Whereas some other games, like Tomb Raider, occasionally got in trouble because sometimes it's strategic and other times it's quick time event based, which is literally just button mashing. Find the button and mash it as hard as you can for like 10 seconds. And these conflicted wildly with each other. And that leads to lower scores. You also want consistent action. There's downtime in movies, TV shows. Video games don't really do that. You don't really want to be bored while playing a video game. You'll just stop playing. In addition, you want to avoid ludonarrative dissonance, which is my favorite word that I managed to work into the thesis because it's like a $10 academic word. So of course it's here. And ludonarrative dissonance is essentially the idea that the game that you are playing is sending you a completely different message than the story you are being told. For instance, in this game, Uncharted 3, you're playing as a guy named Drake, a very Indiana Jones-ish figure. And he's going through levels, shooting guys, just running down entire towns worth of people in order to find like the equivalent of the Lost Ark. So he gets to the end, and the bad guy is like laying there wounded after their final fight. And Drake yells in the cutscene, "I can't leave a man to die," which would work if you had not murdered 400 people to get to this point in the story. It kind of sends the wrong message. That's like, this is an anti-violence game. Like, and so, and this reminds people, I am playing a game. This is not an actual experience, and it takes them out. Like, as silly as it is, it just takes moments like that, and it removes people from the experience. And some high-profile games got in trouble for this over the last 2 years, that just being one of them. So that's an important thing. Finally, you want to telegraph meaningful decisions. When you're wandering around a game, you don't want to accidentally find out that something that you did, like you walked into a certain corner and that led to a character being killed. You'd like to know that that's what your consequences are going to be if you do that. And so this game, The Walking Dead, which you'll remember from the foldback chart before, literally tells you in the corner, X character will remember that when you do stuff. To like highlight, these are the consequences to your actions. Everything you do, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, so to speak. And so that is, so those are some things that games need to do in order to be successful. So while structure ultimately didn't make that much of a difference, I found that these other things did, and that structure does still matter when you're telling a story and when it comes down to choice. You just have to match it to the story you're telling effectively. These were all the sources I did, and that is the end of my long rambling. So are there any questions?
Thank you.